Welcome to the Second Bite podcast, where we talk with top entrepreneurs and CEOs about creating valuable companies through creative transactions. Now, let's get started with the show.
And welcome back to the Second Bite podcast. I'm excited for our episode today. I have Jerad Speigel with me, past founder of Phase One and current founder of Groundswell. Jerad, super happy to have you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
You know, the reason I like this so much, first of all, the podcasts are great because we get to talk to people that are unknown, right? They don't launch themselves into space and they're not on the cover of magazines, but have done something really, really interesting from a professional perspective, particularly like these, because you have been both a seller, an entrepreneur, and a founder who has sold a business or two, and now is embarking on a path where acquisition is an important part of your growth plan. So It's great when we can get both sides of that. We've done this. If for those listening, if you like the content of this, we did a really interesting interview with Matt Sunshine from the Center for Sales Strategy and with Pete Stavinsky from Barrington. Both of those are guys that have done kind of what you have done, Jerad, just maybe to a slightly smaller degree. So as we start off, tell me just a kind of a quick intro, if you will, about Phase One, what that was, and maybe just a quick intro into Groundswell, and then we'll start to unpack it a little bit.
Yeah, definitely. And thanks for having me. Phase One was a really special place. I had done a couple of startups and exits out in the telecom space in the 90s. And then 9/11 happened, and I picked up and moved to DC. I couldn't spell federal, didn't know anything about what was going on. We started a company called Phase One, and our general thesis was just to have white glove service for customers, treat customers exceptionally well, and then to usher in modern technology into the federal space. And that really grew by wildfire. And we ultimately became known as a large Salesforce integrator in federal. We were a Salesforce Platinum certified firm, and really became the place to be if you wanted to do Salesforce work, or if you're a customer and needed complex things built. Salesforce or Phase One was the place to go, and it was a really rewarding experience. Awesome culture, great teams, really a positive attitude, and we felt like we were a positive disruptor in the IT space in federal.
And so, when you say federal, in slang, that means government contracting, correct?
Yep, absolutely.
So it was your first venture into government contracting.
Yeah.
How was that different or unique from working in the enterprise space?
Yeah, I think everyone talks about long sales cycles and longer contracts and things like that, which is all true. My biggest kind of eye opener for me was the scale and size and complexity of the problems, and that's what I really fell in love with. It's awesome to help a public company deal with trying to do something, save money, whatever. But when you come into government and you're serving missions that help the world, help the country, help citizens, whoever, it's a very rewarding experience. And then the scale and how bespoke these problems are. I mean, it's some of the biggest technology challenges in the world. So it was really cool. I fell in love with it. I've been here ever since.
And so you ultimately did a great transaction with Accenture. Did they come and knock on your door, or did you get to the point where you said, hey, it's time for us to do a transaction?
Yeah, I mean, I think that different founders are operate with different types of capabilities. I'm a person who loves kind of, building and growing, to a point to achieve a thesis. I'm a very thesis-driven guy. And, our thesis was, bringing in platform as a service and really kind of bringing Salesforce along as something that would become more ubiquitous in the federal space. We had a lot of big strategics as we were proving out this thesis, a lot of big strategics that were knocking on the door. And so we decided, let's run a process. Let's put this in awesome capability in the hands of a larger, more capable firm who could then start executing on the hundreds and hundreds of millions and billion-dollar deals. So it was a great transaction, and more importantly, a really great landing spot for our folks culturally. And Accenture's a really great place.
So let me ask you this. How do you know the right time in the evolution of a business to sell? Because entrepreneurs are opportunistic and optimistic people. And the glass is always half full, and next year is going to be bigger than this year. Have you learned anything along the way that says this is a signal that it's time for us to sell, or do you just you set a line in the sand, and when you cross that line, it's time for transaction?
Yeah, I think that founders don't think about this enough. I always tell entrepreneurs that, you always have to be thinking about when you're going to exit, how you're going to exit, what you want to be when you exit. At a certain point, you're going to be sitting across the table from really powerful buyers, and they're going to be looking at you and evaluating your company. And did you shape it into what you want it to be? Or did you get to a point where you operate it and just get tired and then it is what it is? And I think you need to purposely grow around a thesis of what you want to do that's differentiated in the market space, and then be always thinking about what the right timing really feels like. I see a lot of founders that get burned out and they just kind of like throw themselves onto the street. I just think that that's a bad way to approach it. I always tell burned out founders, go on vacation for a couple of months and then come back. And if you still, maybe it'll change. But I think for me, it was about accomplishment of a thesis. It was about achieving kind of certain goals, and then knowing that for this to take on the totality of what it could be, getting it in the hands of a more powerful firm, and that's separating me eventually to be able to kind of take on the next sets of challenges. I think that's a part of it. Some people start something and they die in the chair, so to speak, and they do it forever. I'm a person that likes to take on new challenges constantly. And so for me, it was about drawing a line in the sand, really helping with the integration, and then being in a position to start doing other things.
And then how do you wrestle with the notion in your mind? Because when you sold, next year you were going to be bigger and more valuable with a bigger exit and more money for you.
Yeah.
So why sell it now versus just one more year?
Yeah.
How do you wrestle with that?
Well, I think that there are a lot of folks that kind of hold on for exactly that, and I do this little exercise. I tell people about it periodically. I'll share it with your listeners. You open up an Excel spreadsheet and you put your current age, and then you kind of put your like retirement age, call it 70 or 65, whatever. And you look at and you kind of draw down. You're like, all right, I'm X, and you realize you don't have to scroll. Like there's not that many years, and you start blocking out your time in like increments. And you're like, okay, I have 7-year increment, 7-year increment. And I think there's people that are they catch lightning in the bottle. They only want to do it once, or they can only do it once. For me, I've done this several times, and I constantly want to prove to myself and frankly to the market space and people I know that, that I can do this with different ideas and different theses over and over. But to do that, I've got to be practical about how much more time I have left in my career. And I have to block out that time in 7-year increments to kind of see, you have to move along in order to achieve the next sets of goals, I guess is the best way to put it. So
That's helpful.
It's a weird thing, and it's a little bit morbid, I guess, but at the same time, none of us have that as many years in our career as what we think we do.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting when if you think of yourself as you do as an entrepreneur, and to say, okay, I'm gonna see what kind of experiences I have every 7 years, and I'll ready to start anew. So, to give us a rough idea, when you exited phase one, give me a rough idea of the size of the business at that time.
Yeah, I mean, we were, call it, 175 to 100 million, revenue sort of business. We had a big footprint in and around the Fed Civ space. We were taking on a lot of deals that were. I would say that in a lot of cases, we were like an inch deep, mile wide. We had tons and tons of agencies, tons and tons of opportunity, and had become known for a certain thing. And we could see what was going to happen over the market space over the next 10 years, but it was also like a good, exit point. I think there are these like exit ranges that exist. I mean, and for the benefit of your listeners, I mean, you go above 10 million EBITDA and you have certain types of buyers, certain folks are looking for a 25 EBITDA. There are these ranges, and I felt like we kind of fit within a range, and to achieve kind of the next range, it was going to take N number of years. And And admittedly, like everything, it gets back to that 7-year increment idea, and you draw a line in the sand so that you can help with the integration piece, and then you have time to move on and do something else. So it's really kind of an art form in and around that.
And so when you did that transaction, if I remember, you stayed on board with Accenture for a couple years. Was that an earnout period that you had with them?
No, there wasn't an earnout involved, and that's probably about as much as I can say about that. But I first of all, I was when I met with buyers around town, I would ask people like, who are you concerned about, and everybody said Accenture Federal, and it's a really interesting place. I mean, it's they're doing really cutting edge things. It's got a very kind of differentiated culture from the rest of town. And so I really wanted to make sure that the integration went well. I wanted to make sure that they were able to meet the business case. I mean, I think as a seller, I think a lot of sellers don't care. For me, wanting to continue to do more things, it's important as a seller, if you think you're going to do more things, that the buyer is happy with what they bought. And what that translates to is a fair and accurate representation of the business during diligence. And it translates to the integration went well, because that's where everything kind of falls apart. And so it was important that they had a really successful low code practice as part of like what came out of this work. So that means making sure the phase one people found like the right kind of spots. They didn't get lost in the shuffle, providing some leadership in and around, how the integration should work. And I felt really responsible in some ways, for making sure that they met their business case. And they've been really successful over the last several years, I think, because of that. So it was a personal responsibility. It was a commitment I made to the CEO over there that I would be in and around it to make sure that this thing really worked. And yeah, I think it was really successful for them.
So how do you think about this? Because I hear a lot of guys as entrepreneurs, and they say, I don't want a job. I don't want to work for somebody else. I don't want to be in that environment. And you are a classic entrepreneur. Was there anything that you needed to change in terms of your behavior or in terms of your mental process to fit in at a place like Accenture?
Yeah, 100%. And I say that I did it, perfectly or whatever. I mean, I think it's psychologically, it's really different. I've never really worked for anyone. And so you go in and you kind of suddenly realize you have peers, and you're not used to having that. And it's not an ego. I mean, and it's more of a control. You're used to be able to make quick decisions and do the things that you want to do. And they work in a very collaborative way over there, and it's really positive how they do it. And I would say that, when you're not conditioned to that, it really takes some experience. I think that for someone having gone through this, and I think that for a seller who's going to help with the integration, be around a little bit, I think that there's some guidance and some mentorship around doing that, and I think that better conditioning yourself from an emotional, psychological way to be able to do that well, I think is something I'd encourage people to take on.
So you had a few interested parties, I'm assuming, in phase one because of is there anything that, looking back, when you were going through the management presentations and the rest, that you think now would be a really good indicator for any entrepreneur to really know if you're going to fit in or not fit in? Like what questions would you ask, or what traits would you look for?
Yeah. I mean, I think the big thing, I think that there are many types of kind of mid-tier firms here in town, but for us, it was about, building towards a spot that was something that we knew that other people would need to kind of put into their organization. And I think that that's, for us, it was about, they were a group that understood low code. They were already very, very successful with that, and they needed certain types of things that we were doing. And but it was going to be a fit because they understood inherently this sort of thing. I think you have buyers in town that don't know, wouldn't understand kind of the ins and outs of it, would put it in, kind of hope that magic would happen. And I think that's risky, for them. For the seller, it's not risky because they've done the transaction, the risk is on them. But like I said, you kind of want to be known as somebody who built good things, and it really works out for the buyers. And I think that for me, that's the reputation, that it's one of the reputations that I want to make sure I protect.
To finish on that point, do you think it's better as the seller to go into a place that really knows and understands and to a certain degree might be able to micromanage you a little bit, or somebody that doesn't know it at all and doesn't even know the right questions to ask, but you could maybe get away with a lot of stuff?
Yeah. It depends. I mean, I think that there are ways to be able to structure it. They understood inherently what we were doing at Accenture and had a really large global practice in what we were doing. And so they knew enough to not be, obviously confused about what was trying to be attempted. Their thesis was really strong because they understood what was going on and their business case was strong. There are other places where they do want like a shiny object dropped in, and you want to make sure that you've got kind of maybe a carved out space or some way to be able to be an innovation arm. What were the worst transactions in my mind that you see around town, or where they just kind of like take you and like sprinkle all your folks everywhere, and then the whole thing kind of melts,
Yeah.
And again, it goes back to the seller. Some sellers don't care. For me, it's reputational, and I do care. I want to make sure that people are treated well, and I want to make sure business cases make sense, and people say, Jerad builds good stuff and good stuff, and I think that's something that's really important.
And I think it'll become important now as you move on to your next venture, which is now known as Groundswell. Tell me what Groundswell is and what it's going to be.
Yeah. Our thesis, it kind of materialized late 21. Our thesis was, to build out the next great digital transformation shop here in Federal. But more specific to that, you always skate to the puck of what you think is happening in the market space, and what are the areas of specialization you can take on that as it emerges, buyers will really need those types of assets. I think that for phase one, it was similar type story. We were helping Salesforce as it was coming up into the federal space and building its traction. And I think for Groundswell, there are a series of technologies that I think are going to be really powerful, 4 or 5 years from now. And so we want to be known as the ones who brought that along and really built out that capability. That means taking gambles on technologies. It means being really loyal to certain technologies. It means investing a ton in training and development and points of view. And eventually those technologies become ubiquitous, and they don't need, firms like ours as much. But also being really world-class at delivery, helping these technologies build their reputation. So we were able to purchase 3 firms over the last 8 months around this thesis. There are a lot of like roll-ups where they just kind of grab stuff. I mean, this is a very specific thesis of what we're trying to accomplish, and in certain market spaces with certain domain expertise. And so we were able to start putting those pieces together. And so it's been great. The integrations have been really successful. I think the culture is really gelling. The leadership team, a lot of our leadership team is new. They've come in and really been a powerful force. And so we're on a good trajectory, a good glide path. But there were certain pieces that had to come together. And I think that was the big part of the story.
And so can you share or articulate what the thesis is?
Yeah, I mean, there are major nodes of transformation happening in Federal, and Federal's like very much operates like waves. And in commercial, you get people that are trying to outfox their competitors, and they're investing in certain things as differentiators. And in government, they're very, very homogeneous problems, and they kind of move in waves of adoption of different things. And so there are a lot of things happening over in the supply chain world and defense, and these are known knowns out to the market space. There are a lot of things happening in civilian agencies around kind of the business of government, shall we say. And so there are, I've always believed the intersection is around really strong expertise in domain knowledge, and then also the technologies that kind of come along with that. So it's one thing to kind of know SAP, but you really have to inherently understand supply chain, and it's one thing to understand like low code application development, but you really need to understand financial regulatory, And so we have these intersections of those things. And obviously data is big, but just these data companies, that's not enough. You have to understand data, and you have to understand the sciences, or you have to understand data and you have to understand, financial regulatory or whatever it is. So we've been really targeting acquisitions that are geared towards domain expertise and also these technologies. But application development, modernization around the business of government, and then obviously extending out and optimizing supply chain environments. These are really big things over the next 10 years. I think there's a lot of innovation to be done there.
So when you say domain, you're talking about things like supply chain and the others.
Yeah, like real areas of expertise. I think the federal clients have plenty of companies that can do, name a technology, right? And plenty of companies, 50 companies can do, whatever, ServiceNow or something. But really knowing the business of what they're doing is the differentiator, right? I mean, you just can't walk into a place where it's doing like, federal agency maybe that does loan servicing and not understand anything about, finance and banking. You really have to have both of those pieces. Otherwise, you're just kind of like a group that does a thing. And so, we've been investing towards both of those tracks.
And when you talk about technologies, are there particular ones that you're most focused on?
Yeah, we're very fortunate to have a financial sponsor behind us who has a lot of relationships out in Palo Alto and around the world, and really has a line of sight on what's emerging. And I think the federal customers, people kind of think like, oh, well, federal's kind of behind or whatever, and they're really not. My belief is that industry is behind. The federal customers that we have are leaning forward. They want new and modern. They really want to be able to modernize and improve the way they deliver on their missions. Very mission-centric people. And so it's really just takes a dedication to be willing to source out these technologies and bring them in. So obviously in and around the data space, in and around the application development space, AI in its use for major mission functions where it's a clear-cut thing. I mean, people say these words. We have definite use cases where these things are going to be difference makers, and then technology is kind of aligned into what those are. So it's probably about as much of the secret sauce as I want to give away.
Fair enough. So let's shift back to doing transactions. So you've done 3 so far. You've been involved in plenty in your life as a seller. Mm-hmm. Going through that experience as a seller, 2-part question. Number 1, what didn't you know as a seller from the first ones? And the second part, what did you learn from those that has informed you as a buyer to make sure that the integration and the future success of your partner means the success of the whole of Groundswell in this case? Yeah.
I mean, I've had a lot of experience on the seller side. I think if I look way back, to some of the early days, not in DC, it's understanding the component parts of what you need to be successful in a transaction. It's time consuming, and you have to be willing to really dedicate yourself to running your business and dedicate yourself to the process. It's not just something where it's not buying a pack of gum. People on the buyer side are taking big risks. They're betting their own reputations and money and things like that. And so they want to be really careful and make sure they're making good decisions. And so there's a process to it. I mean, I think getting educated, I sit with a lot of, do breakfast and things, with a lot of entrepreneurs, and they just want to know about the process. And it's a very rote process. It's really not that hard to understand. It's just a matter of making sure that you understand it and understand kind of what you're getting yourself into in terms of being able to give all the information that's needed so that the buyers can make the best decision.
What do you think to interrupt, Jerad, what do you think sellers or people you have breakfast with, what do they misunderstand most often about the process?
Well, I think that it seems very opaque for a lot of sellers, right? Like, how would this ever happen? And they're almost waiting for someone to come in and preemptive offer, and it's actually not like that at all, right? It's not like someone comes in and they're like, hey, well, I mean, that happens, of course, and you hear about that, but I feel like there's some sellers around town who don't understand that if they feel like it's time to sell, that they can, and they have to just engage with the right, guidance and counsel to the stuff that you do. I mean, someone can advocate for your business in the market space. I mean, this is what you do, and can go out and advocate for your business and can, find buyers for that business. And the different businesses have different types of structural, challenges to them, and but it's okay. There's generally, if it's a good business, there's a buyer out there to be had. You just need some counsel and someone to guide that process. And I know that's, what you've done successfully over the years. And so I encourage folks to feel like they're kind of getting there, that don't feel like some kind of magical thing is going to walk in their door, but get some expert guidance and counsel and get somebody to really kind of take you to the market space, advocate for you, and then define the buyers. And it'll happen. If you feel like the right time is now as a seller, there are steps you can take to make that happen.
And what do you think was the if there were any missteps in your early days when you started down that road, whether it's practical or expectation wise versus what you see now?
Yeah. I don't know. It's hard to remember way back, but I think you always learn as you go. I think that your tone and tenor during the transaction is really important. It's always easy to lose your cool, and I've lost my cool on buyer and seller side. And then I look back and I'm like, well, that wasn't really the right way. I think the best transactions are when you have a very practical buyer or a very practical seller. I see a lot of times where sellers like overcomplicate it. They'll have like lots of law firms involved or this, that, and the other. And I think the other thing that you learn, and you see this quite a lot, is that, and I tell sellers this all the time, like you have to really understand what's important to you, and at the risk of throwing darts at law firms, they're going to present all the options to you, right? And you can argue about this, that, and the other. And I oftentimes see sellers like arguing, going back, redlining, arguing about a deal point that really is of like no consequence to them. And then about 2 or 3 iterations later, they realize like, I don't really care about it. But what they've done is they've taken 2 or 3 days, they've spent another 10,000 on legal bills, to just come down to the fact of like, is this important? Yeah. And I think really being a practical seller and meshing up with practical buyers so that you can kind of meet in the middle. This makes sense, give this, and it's just, as long as everyone's practical and reasonable about it, it won't be a bad process. And things get really long and drawn out when people are just silly about what they're asking for, So.
Yeah. I think too, to follow up on that point, and I know we had this experience because we did a very good transaction together, which you guys were great buyers on and very patient. I feel like we probably had the wrong legal there. And the reason we had the wrong legal is because it wasn't an M&A guy.
Yeah.
It was a guy that has done M&A in the past. But if there was any advice I would throw out unsolicited, it would be work with a lawyer that does M&A, period, full stop.
I'm glad you brought that up. Yeah. And I meant to say that a few minutes ago. I tell this to founders all the time. There are people that specialize in this. They understand how to do it. And what you find is that, in DC especially, all the M&A lawyers know each other. And so they understand how to get the deals done efficiently, and they understand, what in market or not in market. And they do these deals every day, all day. And those are the people you want. Everybody's got a friend who's a lawyer. Everybody's got like the lawyer who does the real estate stuff, or phase one, we had like 4 different law firms, on retainer for different types of things. And, you got to have the M&A lawyers. They understand how to get it done. It's their specialty. And there are a handful of them are excellent in DC. That's a really good point. Good counsel on the advisory M&A side, which is what you guys are doing. And then really good, legal counsel.
I don't know what you see. What I see is the really good ones cost more money, but they do it quicker.
Yeah.
So the expense is eventually less.
Yeah.
Right. And you don't jeopardize your deal, and it's a better environment. Do you see the same thing?
Yeah. And they're more expensive when you look at like the hourly, but it's not that much. I mean, in the grand total, when they say, hey, it's going to cost X, it's, it's always within kind of the margin of error on that. And in the grand scheme of things, it's not that much money, and
yeah.
And so it depends on the deal size, of course, but it's really not that much money. And you just want experts in your corner. I mean, you can make mistakes in the process if you have a lawyer who doesn't know what they're doing. And deal risk is also there. I mean, some deals fall apart, and it can fall apart in legal wranglings that are just not necessary.
And I think you're answering my next question, but I was going to ask you, what do you find as a buyer the biggest frustration you have that you would like to avoid from a seller? Is it legal, or is there something else you would add to that?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of things. I do ask the question about what counsel they're using, and if it's not adequate counsel, we we may not even enter into a transaction process because it's just going to be too painful. It's painful and expensive on our side to have to cover up for the other person's counsel and explain things. So that's one thing. I think having representation, right, and not going always back to what you guys are doing. I'm not plugging you guys, but I've had good experiences.
You can go right ahead.
Yeah, it sounds like it. It's like not the point, but yeah, I've had good experiences with you, especially. But when they're trying to do this on their own, they're always people or sellers are surprised about what's being asked of them in terms of documentation and things, and it just becomes a cumbersome process, takes too long. I also think like everything's going to come out in diligence. You're looking for folks. I'm always looking for folks that have those two components, and also that there's not yellow and red flags like right out of the gate. And because as you dig more, you're going to find it, and you got to be trustworthy and really kind of you're selling the business and you're kind of spinning on what it is, but at the same time, you got to be, honest about what the business is and if there's risks and things like that are involved. And so I'm always looking for those yellow flags because that just means there's going to be more problems later on.
Right. It's interesting.
Back to the practicality on the seller. I sat across with someone not too long ago who's a prospective seller, and I would not do the deal just because of it was obvious it was going to be a problem. So.
And I talk about deal friction, right? And friction are expenses, and to a deal. And as you know, most of the transactions that we work on, our clients are between $1 million and $4 or $5 million of EBITDA, and so they're typically smaller transactions, and more and more friction will break a deal.
Yeah.
If a deal is large enough, if it's, as you were saying, in a $20 or $30 million EBITDA, and it's going to be a 9-figure transaction, there's plenty of money to spend on legal, and people will do it because it moves the needle in such a meaningful way.
Yep.
But in smaller transactions, I'm saying this because it may sound harsh to say, geez, if this is going to be their lawyer, we just don't want it. Yeah. It's not because of the lawyer, it's because of the amount of friction that it's going to cost versus another transaction that is maybe just as good of a fit for what you're trying to do, that will have less friction.
That's exactly right. That's why I asked the question, about outside counsel. It shouldn't be like a discrete thing, but it is a thing. And I think you get momentum in the bigger deals when you're doing a bigger deal. And it's like, there's momentum in the deal, and the deal's not going to stop unless there's something catastrophic. And I think it's easier as a buyer to when you run into friction in the process, to walk away from something. It's a smaller deal because you realize it's just the cost of the deal is getting onerous because you've got so much friction that it's costing you so much in legal, and you're like, I have to kind of walk away from it. I think that's exactly right. I think that being practical and being reasonable about it, having good counsel, the deal's going to get done, and I think that's the number one thing.
So 2 last questions. Let's, number one, do a little bit of a commercial now for Groundswell. So you guys are going to grow this into something meaningful.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to be successful. You've got great financial team behind you. If somebody had an interesting piece to be a part of the Groundswell movement going forward, what would that look like in terms of size and in terms of service capability, and so that they could either reach out to you through their banker or through us, or what would that look like?
Yeah. I think we're looking for, a couple of different things. Maybe the most important part at this point in the progression of building Groundswell out is really, really being good at something. You have folks that are like, oh, I want a couple of contracts and I do whatever. And that's just kind of an amorphous blob. And it's just not, we're not buying for scale. We're not buying for just like blob things in, really buying for expertise. And so if you have a really solid expertise in something, you're kind of the A team, when it comes to this particular technology or this particular area expertise, like we're really looking for that. And then, market access. I think that they're businesses that have certain sorts of expertise, in certain markets. A lot of places want VA expertise or Intel expertise. And I think those things, for businesses of those sizes, it's more important really maybe to be, inch wide, mile deep. People really, I do this really, really well at these 2 or 3 agencies. And I think that's, kind of the key. And it gets back to integration pieces. I mean, the deal that you and I worked on, was a defense piece, and they were really good at something, and they were really good in a certain key markets, and they had expertise, both domain and technical expertise. And it just, it was a piece that kind of plugged right in. And I think that's more important for us as buyers, is to say, okay, what else do we need for our thesis? But it has to have really world-class delivery. We just can't buy reputational problems, and have to sort out like burning projects. It's just not fair to us as a buyer.
And is there a size criteria or no?
Not really. I mean, we have kind of a floor. We don't want to go too low, because we have already a base of operations from which to grow in terms of EBITDA, but we have a lot of flexibility in terms of our range. I mean, we'll look at smaller things that are really, really good at a thing, and that can easily plug in, where there's no deal friction. They've got good counsel, and it's going to be an easy, practical experience. But that's how we'll get down into some of the smaller deals.
Great. And then my last question would be this, as I always ask when we end up. You've been super successful in your business life, but also in your family life and the community and the rest. Is there something that you would point to, whether it was an experience or a book or a mentor, that you think had a big impact in where you are today?
Yeah. I've never taken on into the mentor thing. And I think that maybe that hasn't served me well. I mean, I probably needed mentors over time. I just kind of always mentored myself. I've always had this belief that, the whole world's your mentor, and you got to be, open to, your aperture's got to be open to learning new things all the time. I think you got to operate with a degree of humility to be able to take those data points in, And then also, I read a lot and try to learn a lot about the world. And I think that, having a broad understanding and appreciation for other people's experiences, backgrounds, beliefs, all that kind of thing is super important. So you can relate to buyers. Every buyer is different. They're going through something different in their life. They've got different emotions, different stages in life. And I think you have to really have empathy to relate to those people, And I think also just bring with a degree of gratitude to the fact that we have these opportunities here in federal and America. Like, we have these opportunities that are unique, and we have to be grateful for those. So I've read some books. Danny Meyer wrote a book called Setting the Table. It is all about hospitality and how he approached, his restaurants and hospitality. And as I read it, it was like never-endingly, notes coming out of it for things that apply back to how we treat our customers, for instance. So I think I never read the business books. I don't subscribe to Harvard Business Review, any of that kind of stuff. I don't read any of that stuff, because I figure we get enough of that coaching, touring just through our experiences. I do try to read books about other industries and, be intellectually curious, and try to be humble and to really operate with a degree of empathy and gratitude for the opportunities that we've got.
That's great. Well, Jerad, this has been a wonderful, 30 or 40 minutes. So I thank you for your generosity and how much you shared. For anybody listening, Jerad can get I know it's difficult to actually get to you, Jerad, which is why it was great you spent the time, but you're at Groundswell. People can get to you through me. There's also contact information. You can reach Jerad on LinkedIn. On the show notes, if you go to secondbitepodcast.com, you can find them all there. There's a couple of other episodes, as I mentioned, for folks if they want to listen to. But this has been a great episode, Jerad. I thank you a bunch for being on board with us today.
Yeah, my pleasure. And thanks for doing this, by the way. I mean, I think it's really important for people to have this sort of information out there. So I think it's a great service. So thanks for doing it.
You bet, Jerad. Thank you.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Second Bite Podcast. We'll see you again next time, and be sure to click subscribe to get future episodes.